All right, what do you guys think? Should we start?
I think it'd be a good idea. Sure.
Sounds
I
good.
think so.
All right, well, my name's Steve Thompson. I'm a reporter at the Washington Post. I'm moderating the panel here on disappearing messages, and I got into this subject because I wrote a story late last year about Maryland Governor Larry Hogan's use of the self-destructing message app Wicker. So our panelists today, we've got Mark Poggioli, who is an attorney who founded the Sunshine and Government Accountability Project, and he's been fighting in a lawsuit for years against the Missouri Governor's Office for its use of the app Confide. We've got Michigan State Representative Stephen Johnson, who has successfully sponsored legislation there to limit government use of these types of apps. And we've got Dr. Edward Pappenfuse, who was Maryland's state archivist for nearly 4 decades, from 1975, I think, to 2013. So we got some folks here who have been thinking a lot about this issue. And Mark, I want to come back to what you've been into in Missouri, but you probably had your head in this as long as anyone, and would be interested if you could kind of set the table for us with your look at this sort of issue as it's played out across the country in the last few years.
Sure. So I'm a trial lawyer in St. Louis, Missouri, and I handle civil rights and transparency litigation. So this sort of came on our radar around Christmas of 2017, when a news story broke in the Kansas City Star by Jason Hancock that Governor Eric Greitens was using Confide, which I think some people will know and others won't, but it's an automatic burner app where it automatically burns or destroys the communication once it's read on the other side. And they were using this to communicate with other staff members in the Missouri Office of Governor. So, it occurred to me that this was wrong, illegal, at least bad practices should be stopped. So we filed a lawsuit probably a week after that occurred, just shortly after Christmas. And, we sought an injunction and all the rest, and we got into this large, multi-year long litigation with the governor's office regarding it. But I would say that's when the first time it sort of popped on the radar. And then when I started doing that, when we started litigating that case, then Josh Hawley, who's now a senator from Missouri, he was attorney general at the time. So he opened up his own parallel investigation into Eric Greitens. We were concerned that that would be a whitewash. So, we were happy to have a civil litigation with subpoena power. So what we did was we sent subpoenas and we, sent discovery requests. And what we learned is that everybody had it in the state, and that everybody was using it. And it wasn't just limited to the governor's office at that time. We would later find out, after Hawley pretty much exonerated Greitens, we would later find out that Hawley's chief of staff also had used Confide prior to the time they initiated the investigation, which raised all kinds of concerns. We also found out that one of the current candidates running for the Senate in Missouri now, his chief of staff, who was in the Treasury office in the Missouri, also used Confide. So we had learned everyone used it. People were coming out of the woodwork saying, oh yeah, I use it to communicate with the governor's office. We had lobbyists saying that they were using it to communicate with the governor's office. So a lot of media descended upon Missouri, and people were curious about what was going on. And then you heard more stories. And obviously it was a national issue. It wasn't just happening in Missouri. What was interesting about Missouri, though, was the rumor was that the person running Eric Greitens' campaign, which was Austin Chambers, and his acolyte was Nick Ayers, who almost became chief of staff to President Trump, but he was at that time the chief of staff in the vice president's office. So you have, this idea that, his right-hand man is telling all these people to use the burner app. So it occurred to us, hey, maybe they're using it elsewhere. Maybe they're using it in the vice president's office. Maybe Nick Ayers is using this app to communicate with Eric Greitens. Maybe this is how they're fundraising for the dark money groups. And we always thought, dark money and dark communications kind of go hand in hand. And this would be a tool, a great tool for a lot of folks to communicate secretly, raise dark money, corporate money, and not know who the donor is. So, and shortly thereafter, we learned from the subpoena power again that the state police in Missouri were using it. They were using another app called, I think it was called Silent Phone, which retains the messages for 90 days or it deletes them automatically. So they used it for years. They purchased it with taxpayer money, and we found out that there were no communications when we sent a request. Al Jazeera actually broke that story by sending sunshine requests in St. Louis. Then we found out that there was a story in California with a police department who had destroyed tens of thousands of communications. And this was day-to-day communications between police who were policing. So it started small. It started in December 2017. And then the next thing we know that it's all over the country. Police departments, politicians, and everybody was using it.
And so what's the problem? I mean, I think, I've heard people say that government officials have been having conversations that go unrecorded, having, chats all over the phone that go unrecorded. They've been doing that, forever. So if you've got an electronic chat that goes away very quickly, what's the difference?
Okay, to me, well, I would say we made a decision as the American people. We've created laws to keep this because we know you can't run a government on phone calls. Throughout history, the Roman Empire, the World War II, the Nazi government, we have archives, we have histories, and usually these are communications that we're able to keep. And so we're able to recreate what happened. It's essential to our culture and to our history, to keep these things so that we understand what actually happened. You can't run a government on phone calls, and they don't. What's concerning, though, is I found out with Confide is they were using group chats. So it wasn't just one-on-one communications, but there were communications with 15 or 20 people, including legislatures, in which they were communicating and sort of trying to get around the law using it. But to answer your question, throughout history, we've already proven, governments don't run on phone calls. Well, they didn't have them for a lot of the time. They can't run on phone calls today. Everything needs to be kept to the greatest extent possible, I think, to preserve history and to give people the opportunity, to know what's going on in their government. I mean, this is critical to democracy as well as, archival issues like that.
And Dr. Papenfuse, you were an archivist when emails came out and became a thing. Do you see echoes of the dilemmas you faced then in this issue? Or what are the similarities or differences in your view?
Well, I think the dilemmas have been there all along. I mean, the problem is archives themselves are a fairly young thing as far as the public responsibility is concerned. They only go back to about the third decade of the 20th century in terms of being concerned about preserving public information for public use and for retrospection. The biggest difficulty of all with this is the laws that now exist have no penalties related to them. Second of all, it's very much based upon trust, dealing with the whole question of how you go about telling heads of government, agency heads, anybody involved in the public business, how they are supposed to preserve the public record. the principle is a very simple one, and that is there has to be a very careful analysis of how people are communicating, what they're communicating with, and a decision made with regard to saving it. All right, and that has to be done in an almost bureaucratic way, which is called a records retention and disposal schedule. So we have tried without having any penalty, with mostly having to deal with the question of persuasion, to achieve a corpus of public information that is honest to the process of how government functions, how people behave as public employees, but there are always ways in which to get around it. And when you do not have a penalty, and when you do not have a fully articulated archival program, let me give you an example of what I mean by that. In Maryland, we have a very good archives program. I can say that because I ran it for 30 years. Okay, I forget that. But the point is, in Maryland, it's split with regard to the responsibility of determining what records to save. When I first became archivist, we were in the same agency that dispensed toilet paper to the rest of the world, at least as far as Maryland was concerned. And the same thing was true with the National Archives. You were part of the General Services Administration. You really didn't have any way of effectively, neutrally doing what you were supposed to be doing. We were the first state agency to really separate ourselves from the Department of General Services. Most archives today in the state level are part of the Secretary of State's office. And now you know what the Secretary of State's offices are going through right now. So again, I'm not really fully answering your question. I think what really is important to understand here is that in a democracy, we have an obligation to have really strong archival laws with a bite to them that makes it possible that the records that should be preserved are preserved. Now, the electronic world provides you an enormous opportunity of doing this inexpensively, far less expensive than the paper world of the past, okay? And it ought to be an integral part of any public official's responsibility, anybody on the public payroll, that there is no such thing as private communication, period. All right, that private, you can designate anything that you use to communicate as being private. You can have that right to do so. And then it will take a judge, or at least it'll take a court environment to free it in terms of public information is concerned. And I say, let them have that right, because you have to then go through the legal process of which Mark has done an awful lot on, to go through in order to be able to look at what the individual has determined as private. But I don't think there should be private phones for public officials. You're going to communicate however you communicate. I don't care who you communicate with your mistress and you mark it private, fine. Then a judge is going to have to say, yes, this is relevant to the Freedom of Information request. Now, but you got to do that. You can't just, if you don't have that legal responsibility, archivists are just simply tied up in knots and will do their best. Now, I will say that I want to, Steve and I don't fully agree on a certain governor's behavior. All right. So let's be very clear about that. All right. Because I do believe that within government, public officials have a right to, let's just say, strategize with regard to what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. They have a right to have private opinions that they don't make public. Depends on how they eventually manifest themselves as public. All right. So the question is, how do you provide at least an arena within the public information environment that these communications have to be at least examined by a third party to determine whether or not they ought to be made part of the public discussion. Okay. That's my view. Now, as far as my term as archivist was concerned, we always had pretty decent cooperation with the governor's office with regard to the transfer of public records. Even through some of the more, well, I better be careful where I go with this. But the answer is things remained fairly decent until the huge expansion of communication virtually. Then suddenly this was a massive problem with regard to how people basically communicated and how you held on to what was really part of the public information side of things. So
We- You,
it's very easy for me to go on and on here. So Steve, cut me off and tell me that I'm just doing
Well,
saying.
I was going to say, you point out an irony I hadn't thought of, which is that we've got these great new tools that allow us to keep these communications much better. So as you say, judges or whoever needs to can sort through them and see what should be public and what shouldn't. And instead of using them to keep stuff, we're using them to make sure stuff doesn't get kept.
Yeah.
So Representative Johnson, in Michigan, you saw this happening. Can you tell us how this first came across your radar there?
Yeah, earlier Mark was asking if we had saw what happened in Missouri, and sadly, I think states are often in silos and we don't see what's going on in other places. It was early 2021. It was sort of lucky in some regards that we found out. I believe it was in the state police regarding a wrongful termination lawsuit. So it was in the courts, and in their discovery process, I think is when one of the attorneys found out, hey, they're not providing everything because they have this app that is hiding communication. And they knew that because their client was in the state police and he was doing that. And so that kind of made the news. And all of a sudden people started saying, wait a minute, are all state police having this app Signal on their phone where they can delete messages? And it came out the Colonel Gasper, the head of the state police in Michigan, had this app on his phone as well. Now, I think they all claimed that they weren't doing any official communication. So nothing that was subject to FOIA would have been on there. But it brought the question of, how do we know that? We can only take your word. If you send a message through and it deletes and you say, no, trust me, that had nothing to do with my official business, we're back to the world of trust. And that's the whole point of FOIA, is we don't trust, we want to verify. And so when we saw that, we said, all right, we've got to step in. This is clearly going to be a growing concern as technology moves forward. And so we introduced legislation that would prohibit, I'm just going to read it right here because it's very short. The department shall issue directives that all state departments and all state agencies must not use any app, software, or other technology that prevents it from maintaining or preserving a public record as required by law on an electronic device that is used to create a public record. So essentially, hey, if this is a device that's used for public record, you can't have something on there that allows you to delete that. And we actually ended up getting that passed through with unanimous support in the House and Senate. Got governor to sign it, which we're in mixed power here in Michigan. So that's not an easy task to do. Doesn't mean we didn't face any headwinds in the process. Lots of objections were made behind the scenes. Everyone is in favor of transparency in front of the media and in front of their constituents, but behind the scenes, there are some games trying to stop it.
What were the objections?
So yeah, the number one objection we heard is a lot of people, they use their personal phone for work. And they say, well, you shouldn't be able to tell them what they can and cannot have on their personal phone. And we can have a discussion on whether the state should be providing an official phone for them, if they should have two different phones or not. That to me was never the discussion. That's a separate one. The main issue I would say is, if your phone is subject to FOIA, whether it's a personal or an official phone given to you, but it's subject to FOIA because you do official work on it, you can't have those apps because you now no longer have, you've lost the trust that we can trust that those messages are being saved. And so that was always kind of the top thing being pushed at us is, well, what about people that have, this for other purposes? And I'm fine. If you got a personal phone and you want to do that, I mean, hey, I'm a big believer that you should be skeptical about government. I like the idea that these apps exist, but when you are now in the government sphere and those records are supposed to be tracked for government purposes. That is our law here in Michigan. We have to have a way to verify that. And basically what happened, I mean, in this court case, the attorneys were arguing, we have lost all these records. And the defendants claim, no, they never existed. Now it's your word against my word. And what we're trying to get away from with the FOIA statute is, we don't need to trust your word. We can go to the source document. And so even though at the end of the day, a lot of people didn't necessarily like this bill. When we put it up for a vote, everyone voted for it. It looked bad to vote no on something like this.
Mhm.
Was there a bite to it? Was there a fine involved? I thought there was some sort of no prosecutorial.
No. So that's if you want to make the legislation better, and maybe future legislatures there should be a fine. And actually now I'm looking at it right now. It's requiring the department to, which I think is DTMB here in Michigan. They have to issue a directive to every department. Hey, you've got to do this policy. Number one, I gotta go verify that they're doing that. But number two, we should be able to have some sort of penalty, maybe something like a civil fine. If they're not doing that, money tends to get government to cooperate. If you say, all right, you're not doing this, a reporter can now figure that out, sue you and get some financial damages. The best thing is this is how we can get things started. Hopefully we can go in and see, are they following through or not? And hopefully more states do this. I mean, clearly Missouri had a similar issue, and I'm guessing other states are having these issues and don't even realize it.
What agencies does it apply to?
In Michigan, it's every agency. So I believe it's the Department of Technology Management and Budget. They're the ones that kind of draft policies for every agency. And so they're the ones that'll put the directive out. So it's going to go to DHHS, it's going to go to MSP, it's going to go to Department of Transportation. Everyone is going to have to, if they've got an electronic device, which they all do, that device can no longer have any sort of software that allows them to delete messages that are required for a public record.
Does it apply to the governor's office and does it apply to legislators?
Well, so that's the problem here in Michigan. The governor's office in the legislature is not subject to FOIA, so it wouldn't apply to us. And that's sort of, that has been a long-standing battle, my 3 terms here. The House has passed legislation subjecting the legislature and the governor to FOIA, and then the Senate kind of sits on it. It's amazing how this political game kind of revolves every 2 years. And I think it's the key with the legislation. It says anything subject to a public record. So you're not getting too in the weeds. Hey, if FOIA applies to you, this is going to apply to you. Hopefully in the future, we can get the governor's office and the legislature added to that statute.
And can you give us the name and the number of that law? So if anybody's paying attention and they want to go Google it, what would they Google? House bill, such and such?
Yeah, it'd be House Bill 4778. You can look at MCL 10.1101 Section 270, if that helps them.
All right. And you mentioned discovery. This came up in a discovery issue, and I'd be interested in anybody's thoughts on, I look at it a lot like discovery. Like if you have a records retention, you can, as a business, you could have any records retention policy you wanted. And as long as, my understanding is, as long as you are sort of following that retention schedule in your normal course of business, if something's gone by the time there's a discovery request for it, or by the time there's a lawsuit that might generate a discovery request, it's gone. Nothing anybody can do about it. And Mark, I think in your lawsuit in Missouri, you've been sort of taking a different stance on that in regards to FOIA law, that if you have, I just ask it this way: if a government had a records retention policy that said we're going to destroy everything in this certain platform after a week, could it do that and still comply with the public records law?
Okay, so that's a complicated question, and it's going to be different for each state. In Missouri, we have a retention rule, which makes a determination of which communications need to be kept for how long. And unfortunately, most people, I don't think, understand it. It's very vaguely and ambiguously written. There's a transitory exception for transitory communication, which has caused a tremendous amount of mischief, because some people will say, well, every text message is transitory because they're very short, but that's not what it means, I don't think. But some people will, the governor's office argued that it was indeed transitory. And Senator Hawley, when he was Attorney General, argued that all of those communications within the governor's office that were destroyed were indeed transitory so that they didn't have to be kept for the normal 2-year period, or in the case of the governor, permanently. Because in Missouri, if you're the governor and you're communicating, that goes to the archives, right? That's something that's kept permanently. But there's also the issue of when you submit the request. So in fact, one of the reasons we lost our case was because we submitted the Sunshine request, quote, after they destroyed the records. And had, the Sunshine request been submitted and then records would have been destroyed, perhaps that would have created standing in order to keep the claim going. And then there's the third issue that I think you're sort of talking about, which is the issue of spoliation, or which we call, which is the destruction of evidence. And yeah, I mean, whether you're a corporation or a government, I deal with the issue of spoliation constantly because, we're suing governments who have injured folks, whether it's civil rights, or police departments, or whether it's jails in which people have died. There are records that have disappeared, and they should have been kept under the retention laws. So we will go and file motions. I mean, obviously you can't get it back, but it creates an inference for the jury or for the judge that the reason that they're destroyed was because they were bad for the government. So that's why they destroyed them. So it's called an adverse inference. But again, the adverse inference, it's good for a trial and it's good for the plaintiff lawyer bringing the case, but it doesn't bring back the record. It doesn't get you the document. And that's where I think Ed was talking earlier, and Steve a little bit about, well, what's the enforcement behind this? And in Missouri, we've learned a tough lesson through my lawsuit. There isn't any regarding the retention issue. So if they don't retain and follow the retention rules, I can't do anything about it as an individual or as a resident or a citizen of the state. I'm reliant upon typically prosecutors or attorney generals that have enormous political conflicts of interest, who simply aren't going to go after maybe someone from the same party, which is usually, well, it has been the case in Missouri for the past, 5 or 10 years. So there's no motivation. Hawley didn't do it with Greitens. Eric Schmidt, who then became the attorney general, doesn't do it. There was a story just a few weeks ago of St. Louis County destroying, upwards of 20,000 pounds of records and violating the retention period. And we have a prosecutor that's a block away from me who hasn't done anything, who hasn't said anything. And we have an attorney general who's running for the Senate who's too busy or hasn't said anything either. So this destruction is, it's become commonplace. And for Ed and the archivists out there, I mean, it's terrible. And for us, it's terrible. And for people who vote and are interested in these records, it's terrible. And if we need new laws, and I think we need a national model for retention, and it needs to have some criminal components, that if you do it intentionally and you're destroying documents that you should keep, there needs to be a criminal element to that.
Would you agree with that, Dr. Popenfuse? You were saying that something similar.
Actually, there is a model, and that's what the National Archives has. That's why this ex-president got hoisted on his own petard. You can have a national model, but the problem we've got in this country, as you know full well, is there's a lot of resistance to national models for anything. And that brings you back to this problem of a political climate in which nobody is really looking at the fundamental problem, which is how do we keep the valuable information about what government does and how it does it in order to keep our democracy, as opposed to destroying it, as we have a tendency, I think, these days to move in the direction of doing. I think that one of the things that we really have to try to balance here is that, yes, within government, there has to be a means of modeling and thinking through on policy and working out policy that, for a time at least, and you can argue about how much time, for a time at least, has to be something that isn't every moment of that process being aware of by the whole world about it, because that's simply not the best way to develop policy. What I'm suggesting to you is there has to be private conversations for a period of time among public officials that are not easy to get to. Can you get to them? Yes, but not easy to get to. And I think that gets back to this whole business of, it's like your question about destroying, 20 tons of records. All right. In today's world, most of those records should be electronic. And, they have a electronic version of it at any rate. So there should be a process whereby those electronic records immediately go into a vault. They're accessible for the agency that needs to work with them, but they are actually managed by and maintained by an archival agency. But, that's pie in the sky, I know, all right, especially in the way today's world is. But if you want this democracy to survive, you've got to have this kind of environment of access to near current information, all current communication, some of which has to go through the filter of a judge or through the way you're doing it, which is basically, okay, we know you did wrong, and now I want to see the documents. And then when you find that they did do wrong, fine. Or if they didn't, they didn't. Okay, I'm realize that I'm going on too long here. I just feel very strongly that we have an obligation in this country to stop and think about how we know what we know and where it is kept and how we can get to it when we really want to know more. Now, my life is easy these days because I'm interested in the 19th century. And so, I don't have the same kinds of problems that you guys have right now, but it's except globally in terms of what I'd like to see happen. So as far as Maryland is concerned, we're split. The governor's office tried to argue that they weren't governed by records retention and disposal schedules. They've given that up. And that is basically the way things seem to be going right now. And remember, I'm not in charge now. But as I understand what's going on right now, as we move into the transition from this particular administration into the next administration, they're abiding by a records retention and disposal schedules. Efforts are being made to preserve all of the communications that relate to the functioning of government, which is going to include access to any apps that are still being used, which I don't think they ought to be used, but that's me. I'm just telling you my standpoint here. So it's possible, but we're in such a divisive political world right now. It's amazing that anything gets done.
So
Period.
Speaking of divisive political worlds, I want to ask Representative Johnson, because you're a Republican and you champion this legislation to keep government open, and it seems like as I look around and look at the FOIA laws, the state FOIA laws, if you look at Texas, for instance, they've got a great state FOIA law, and that's a Republican-controlled state. Yet we see some examples of some Republican leaders that have done things that seem to subvert the intent of FOIA laws and so forth. But we see that from Democratic leaders too. So I'm curious what your take is on, is this something that just sort of transcends party lines? Does one party have a better claim on these issues than the other? What do you think?
Oh gosh, yeah, this is definitely politics influences it, right? So I came in, my first term would have been the last 2 years. Rick Snyder in Michigan, who was a Republican, probably if you know him through kind of the Flint water scandal. At the time, Democrats, they wanted all kinds of transparency within the executive branch. And then when the Democrat Governor Whitmer comes in 2018, we've had a number of bills to increase transparency within the executive branch, and now they're not so interested in it. And it does seem to be purely political. Everyone claims to be for transparency when they run for election. When they're in front of their voters, they say they're for it. But when they think it might hurt their person, so to speak, all of a sudden they don't seem to care as much. I mean, you look at right now, people talking about President Trump and what's going on with some of those documents, yet people didn't seem to have that same opinion with Hillary Clinton deleting a bunch of emails. And it just seems to be purely politics, right? And that's unfortunate. Hopefully, as time goes on, you can start to say, when people put things in writing, all right, we put things on social media saying we support something, and they say, all right, well, you said you supported this when it was the other person in charge. Now that it's your person in charge, let's hope you actually follow through and continue to support that. And we've had that. I know we've had people in the Michigan legislature that they've held true from either they were for transparency under Republicans, still are under Democrat, or some of them, were against it back then. They still are against it. At least consistency is important. But sadly, it does seem to be, if they're trying to protect their person or not protect their person, hopefully we can get away from the politics of a personality and just kind of focus more on policy.
It sounds like you found this.
All right, go ahead.
All I was going to say is, I think you found this in Michigan, and I've seen it a little bit in Maryland. It does seem to be an issue that people respond to, like nobody wants to be overtly on the wrong side of transparency politically. But Dr. Pappenfuse, what were you going to say?
It's just, I want to make sure that I'm not sounding anti-Republican here or political, because I'm not. What I'm basically saying is that in a democracy, you're better off if you have an independent agency that is responsible for preserving and caring for public communications in the public record, and that you would be far better. That removes it from the political arena, because it's a necessary institution within the democracy. Democrats have been as bad about this as Republicans have been bad about it. So I don't want to sound as if I'm just simply commenting about current politics and one former president, because I'm not. I'm basically looking at this in terms of how in a democracy can we maintain an information base that's the essential to basically good government, and to be able to pursue, whether it is a conservative approach to how you handle governmental issues, or it is a liberal approach. The information upon which you develop policy, as well as tracking those people who are trying to create policy, is absolutely important and ought to be handled and managed by a neutral environment. And that brings along the bureaucracy that sometimes is really frustrating, but I think it's better than not having it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
I've said way too much, so I apologize, Steve. I think your law's a good one. I think that this is in the right direction, because it points to what people ought to be doing. And I'm sorry it doesn't have a penalty associated with it, but maybe you'll get one of these days.
No, and it doesn't matter if you're conservative or liberal. I think the nature of man is the same. Someone in power doesn't want to do something that they think could be a threat to their power. And that's why it's usually key. Get people on the record before they have the power, when they're running for that office to have the power, get them on the record saying, hey, what do you believe on this issue? Because it doesn't matter, in my limited experience, Republican or Democrat, whoever has power is going to jealously try to hold on to it, and anything they view as a threat to it, they're going to oppose.
Yes.
I think that's a good point. Do any of us know if any other state in the country has done what Michigan has done on making some kind of reacting in some way legislatively to the burner app issue?
I can say Missouri has not.
Maryland hasn't. So Maryland legislators made an attempt, but it didn't really go anywhere.
I'm not aware of any. As I see some of these comments here, someone's wondering if it applies to local governments, and I'm looking. Our law doesn't. And our local governments are required to follow FOIA, and yet reading this statute, it's about state departments and state agencies. So I'm already seeing a fix that we missed here. We've got to make sure we apply this to local units of government as well, our counties and cities and villages and townships, and put some sort of penalty. So there's still room in Michigan to make this better as well.
Mark, with this lawsuit that you launched, now initially, a judge dismissed it, and can you tell us why the judge dismissed your original lawsuit? Well, not the one that's still, I guess, ongoing, but why did it originally get dismissed? What happened there?
Well, and I'm assuming you're talking about the one against Governor Greitens for the use of Confide, because
Right.
we do have several. It was dismissed basically because the judge determined that there were two laws in play. One is the state FOIA law, which is 610 Missouri Revised Statute. That gives, and this is critical, that gives a private right of action. I don't care where you're at or what state you live in, having a private right of action is the biggest thing of all. It allows anyone, you or me, to bring a lawsuit for someone for violating it. Now, the judge ruled that 610 did not deal with the scenario that we had with the governor destroying documents, but rather it was the retention rules. So what he was saying was it was under 109, which was a law that was really never litigated. And no one was even sure in the state until we brought the lawsuit whether or not there would be a private right of action to bring it under 109. The judge ruled there wasn't, and it was upheld. So in Missouri right now, we're stuck in this weird scenario where if it's a destruction of record, that can only be, maybe you could sue to enjoin the destruction and to prevent the destruction if you know about it ahead of time, possibly in civil court. But otherwise, it's up to the attorney general, again, or a local prosecutor to bring an action under 109 for violating the law, which in Missouri, there are criminal provisions of this. I mean, there's some old laws that were written back in the 1800s about, if you're turning over your office, if you lose your office and you're turning it over and you burn your records, you can go to jail. So there is some bite to 109, but no one's ever brought it, a case against anyone in Missouri that I can see. There's one under investigation right now in Kansas City by a sheriff's department. So that's the distinction that we had. The private right of action, he said, no, you can't do it. Now the attorney general or prosecutor or somebody else can do it. Now that's going to be different from state to state, depending on if they separate the FOIA laws from the retention rules or the retention laws. And that I don't know. I'm assuming each state's going to be vastly different.
But similar in that my guess is that most states have a FOIA law over here and whatever records, laws, or policies they have over here. At least that's certainly what I ran into in Maryland, where if I make a FOIA request, well, they have to turn it over. But by the time I request it, it's gone. And there's nothing in the FOIA law that says you should have kept it. I mean, now if they'd have destroyed it after I made the request, that gets tricky. But what I tried to do in some cases was to make the request, at 10 a.m. in the morning for stuff that had been sent in the last 12 hours. But even that, practically speaking, they're not likely to get to a FOIA request until 24 hours later or much longer. And by 24 hours was when the stuff was set to be destroyed. So, it was kind of like a catch-22. It was, they weren't breaking the FOIA law as far as I could tell, but they were just getting around it. Because as Dr. Papenfuse says, you can't make a determination on it if it's gone, right? So
it teaches you to be creative as a requester too, for journalists or lawyers or anybody out there. I mean, we get creative with our requests. Sometimes we ask for, all communications, and maybe something that'll happen in the future. A communication made on a phone or made to a party at any time. And then you keep that request out there. So if they start destroying it, then maybe they're going to get in trouble under our local FOIA law instead of just under the retention law. And we had that example with, I told you about St. Louis County destroying the 20,000 pounds of documents. Now, not only were those, I think, relevant to two litigations that I'm part of, one in federal court, but also we had a sunshine request out that asked for some of those records. So it was destroyed after the request. So there's certainly going to be a litigation based on 610. And I think if they appeal that, it will get upheld in our favor. But it's like you say, it's a cat and mouse game. And the government's always trying to figure out a way to get to secret the communication or to not produce it. And that's just the way it's always going to be. And that's why we need tougher laws, stronger enforcement, and more sunshine requests and more litigation. Unfortunately, in St. Louis, we have St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Kansas City Star. We have these newspapers, and they send tons of sunshine requests, tons of FOIA, but they can't afford, right? The owners of these papers, they can't afford to litigate every denial. So funding would be great, something that can help everybody litigate this more, because I think litigation does concern the government. I feel like I get more answers now that they know I'm willing to litigate. Until the day they know you're willing to litigate, they sort of treat you like, it's no big deal. Steve's not going to file a lawsuit. Don't worry about it. Just give him nothing or tell him we destroyed the documents. So there needs to be that pressure. And
Goes back to teeth, right? Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's not enough. And newspapers do have limited budgets. They can't hire lawyers to do all this either. So it's a tough situation for sure.
Couple thoughts on that, if I can jump in real quick. Number one, like a loser pay model works well with that. I think of, all right, if they think, well, we'll just wait you out here, but if they got to pay you and you win, that's different. And the other thing, just a comment, it's interesting, government, not the most efficient, not the best at meeting deadlines, but when it comes to deleting records, they're pretty efficient. They're pretty good at deleting those things right on time. And that should always be cause for concern of why are they so good at deleting records, not really doing anything else though.
Now, two great points. In fact, in Missouri, we don't have a loser wins. So we have a scenario where you can win the FOIA lawsuit, but you have to prove that they knowingly and purposefully violated the law, which is a pretty high standard. And to be honest, I would say less than 50% of the time, plaintiffs are able to prove sort of that criminal intent that we knew we were violating the law. So therefore, a plaintiff here can spend whatever amount of time in 2 years, they can win the lawsuit and not get attorney's fees and not get fines. We've tried to amend that law. No one's interested in doing it. Even when we were in the headlines every day with the Greitens fiasco, they were still unwilling simply to ban the use of Confide, not even other burner apps, just an automatic burner app. I mean, they wouldn't do anything. And so it's difficult here, but I totally agree. The loser pays model is the model it should be everywhere. And that would certainly make government, it would change the risk benefit analysis for them and their lawyers.
Certainly changes it for us, when we think about whether we're going to sue somebody.
Sure.
It makes it a lot easier to know if you got a slam dunk case and you win, then maybe it's not going to cost you.
And more lawyers would take them. And a lot of lawyers I know would be like, I'd love to take them, but if I win, I'm not going to get paid. Right. In most cases. So where's the incentive for the lawyer population in your state to sort of say, hey, Steve, we'd love you as a client. We're going to go win this case. We don't have it here. We have it at a minimal level. But that's not enough.
We got just a few minutes left. If anybody's got questions, pop them in. And meanwhile, I'll just make the comment that if there are journalists listening, one thing that I found useful was, even though you've got messages that are disappearing, what doesn't disappear is often the structure of the chat rooms. In the Maryland governor's case, he had chat rooms called, inner sanctum and front office and executive team. And it was possible to get some documentation through FOIA on who's in those chat rooms, who are the members of the chat room, what are the chat rooms called, who are the members, when were they set up, things like that, even if you couldn't see the messages in them. So that's something. And I think, Mark, you might have done something similar with Confide on that, right?
We wrote, well, we actually took an expert testimony who argued that while the messages might be gone, you could still determine how many were sent, how many were received, and other particles of the messages, metadata, basically. So, I mean, this has taught us as a lawyer or as a journalist. Now, not only do we ask for documents and communications, we're asking for metadata to make sure they don't destroy the metadata. Because there's a digital trace of almost anything. And a lot of times, even these experts will testify that you can't destroy that. So at least you can have some outline of, was the governor's office using it every day for 5 months, or did someone download it and use it once for 1 day? They can't make that go away. In most
What
cases.
kind of metadata would you ask for? What might you ask for there specifically?
Yeah,
How
I mean,
would you ask for it?
sometimes I would just ask for metadata. I mean, I've been in a couple litigations I'm in. We do this in discovery a lot too. We'll ask for Microsoft sent and received logs, which is a log of whether or not emails were sent and received or opened by a government official. So if they don't have the email because they say they destroyed it, you can know that it was sent on a particular day by getting the Microsoft logs. So there are ways to sort of, to think around it, to say, if they don't have the document, would there be any evidence that they sent it or received it, or would somebody else have looked at it, and would there be evidence of that? So, I mean, routinely now we ask for metadata. Most government offices are run with these, software programs. Jails are run with, IJMS software that's usually a third-party company runs it. And they have all this information of who comes in and who edits things, maybe after the fact, which I've seen quite a bit of in government, employees coming in to fix a record to maybe not make it look so bad. So that, I think, for journalists and lawyers, this is always something to consider, because now software is how government is run. And we need to make sure that the backdating of these records aren't being done, because I see it all the time.
That would theoretically get you in a lot of trouble in a discovery situation, right?
Absolutely.
Dr. Poppenfuse, we talked earlier about transitory records, and I think that's something worth dwelling on a minute. What's a transitory record, and how do we tell a transitory record from another type of record?
Well, I'm very curious about how this Yaley interpreted the word transitory in Missouri. So how about telling me how Senator Hawley came to this absolutely wonderful decision that transitory meant you could destroy it?
Yeah, well, there's actually a 5-page report on it. I could probably find it and send it to you.
No, summarize it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So
I avoid the question.
I think what I think it means is a draft.
Right.
It's a draft. It's a communication that isn't actually sent. They turned it into a short communication, a no big deal, let's meet for lunch, those types of communications, which they determined were all done on Confide, which doesn't make sense, because you wouldn't make plans to meet at a particular time and date on a disappearing app that you weren't able to review later. So, but he got this idea, interestingly enough, from Governor Walker in Wisconsin, who actually changed the law to make it's very interesting, and I read a bunch of stories about this, and apparently the Wisconsin people revolted, and they had this huge fight over the meaning of transitory, and the Republicans at that time, who I believe had power, or at least in the governor's office, had to roll it back. But of course, when Hawley saw that, I think he imported that idea that Walker tried to use in Wisconsin. He imported that into Missouri in order to whitewash the investigation of Governor Greitens.
Well, from an archivist standpoint, nothing is transitory. Take for example, and be careful about what I'm doing here, but it's like the whole business with the meaning of the Second Amendment. Some of the best documentation is the process by which the final amendment came to be adopted. And that is really at the heart of the argument of what the actual meaning of the Second Amendment is. Now, I happen to disagree with the Supreme Court's position, but it doesn't matter. Personally, what I'm saying is that transitory, it's there for a short period of time, right, as far as the discussion is concerned. But it's not transitory with regard to the whole question of meaning over time. And so the real question here is the point at which, if it really isn't of importance to the process, and it doesn't shed any real light on the process, that's part of the appraisal process of saying, well, at some point, it's something that we really don't need to hold on to. That's the whole purpose of records appraisal and transfer. If from the very beginning, as these communications are taking place, these chat room communications are taking place, it is a requirement that it is saved, period, that it goes to a depository environment for ultimate use or disposition. This gets back to the question of the flow of the record of government. I mean, it seems to me this is the extraordinary abuse to use a chat room to develop policy, whatever that policy may be, and not keep a record of it.
Yeah.
So
Well,
then, yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going off again.
No.
but
I was just
agree
gonna
with-
say, I was just gonna agree with you to say, to your point, when Hawley investigated what happened with Greif, he only found 3 people used it, and it was for minor meetings. When we used our subpoena power, we found out it was more than 20. And we
Right.
also found out they were discussing the creation of legislation. So they were writing back and forth about editing legislation that they were trying to pass. I mean, they actually had pictures of so that's exactly what they were doing. It was that process, and they destroyed it.
Right. Well, yeah. So the key here, I wish that we could remove the question of staying in power away from all of this, and to get people to realize that it is to everybody's benefit to maintain and to analyze the record. That's what an archives is supposed to be doing, and to give the power, and also to give it a bite when it's abused. That will hopefully contribute to fewer dirty tricks in this world, fewer abuses of the power of the office, whether it's by a Republican, Democrat, progressive, I don't care where you want to be. It has to do with how people behave in the process of doing the public's business. All right. And we've got to maintain a record environment in which decisions can be made sensibly and effectively with regard to whether or not the individual who is entrusted with this is actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. I mean, ignorance of the law is no defense. And I think this whole business of destroying records because you didn't realize you were supposed to have a records retention and disposal schedule is nonsense. And there ought to be some way of really enforcing that without it being a political issue. Now that's going to be hard. I know it's going to be hard because it's you get into this whole business of yes, I don't want to go there. I'm just simply say that we've got some to do in terms of making sure that the record is kept, maintained, and accessible.
And I was just going to add one thing. I was just going to add one thing. It's a deterrent. Transparency is a deterrent to bad behavior. You know, if you had it and you couldn't do these things and like delete the communications, maybe we wouldn't have a shadow foreign policy that's being run by Jared Kushner with NBS in Saudi Arabia. It's a deterrent. Right now, there's no deterrent. They can do all of these things because there's no deterrent.
We'll leave it on that note. They're ringing the bell on us. So
I want to give Steve an answer because Hillary's use of a private server was wrong.
Yeah.
I agree. Okay. And that was public business. So you've got to be very careful about yes, this is not so much a party issue as it's a public responsibility issue. And
No
I'm
doubt.
part of it. Okay? So I'm sorry, I took too long.
Well, thanks, you guys. I think we're out of time, so thanks for being here. If the audience is still with us, thanks for listening, and we'll sign off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Are we being signed off? Yes, I guess we are.